Hi, welcome to Tuesday Talk, and my name is Shawanda Randolph, and we have been talking about toxic situations. Well, this week, as you join me, we are talking about, is it me or is it them? Listen, when it comes to toxic situations, it can be very, very tough trying to figure out who is a toxic person. So remember, we talked about how toxic situations can cause a lot of confusion because of some of the signs of what's going on in those situations. Well, today we really want to help you to kind of figure out, is it me or is it them? Because when we're looking at all the confusion, it does make it very difficult to kind of determine whether you're the toxic person or if in fact the other person is toxic. Let's dive in. All right. One of the hardest issues in the beginning of a toxic relationship is determining if the situation is in fact toxic. The crazy making feelings that you have at the beginning are your red flags. These are your clues. But in the beginning, there are so many factors that kind of cloud your judgment, and things are simply just not black and white, right? Now, when we're growing up, we learn about stranger danger, and we're taught that bad people want to do us harm. They want to do bad things to us, right? And so when we think about that, we think about, or we're imagining like, oh my gosh, we have these like obvious people, and we think of like imagine like the most crazy looking people, right? Well, the fact is that sometimes the most broken people look very, very ordinary and have even positions of authority. And recognizing someone is toxic can be very, very challenging, especially if you don't have some type of professional experience or professional education. And like when we're dealing with like psychology or something like that, right? Well, when we are dealing with toxic situations, this can kind of leave people feeling like maybe it's them when it actually isn't, right? So like I talked about, you're trying to figure out, is it me or is it you? Like, who's a toxic person in this relationship? Because toxic people are very, very savvy. So they've spent years consciously and subconsciously honing their craft, whether they know it or not. They've actually made their life or made their way through life kind of like manipulating and bullying and whining and crying all their way through life to get whatever it is that they want. And they do it for a variation of reasons. And quite frankly, they do it because it works, right? And we have to remember, these are individuals who are going through their own challenges and just haven't really dealt with or haven't faced the challenges in their lives that they've experienced, and they just haven't gotten the right help. So like just to say, you have this good person that's had all these bad things happen to them. And so now that they've had all these bad things happen to them, they are now dealing with it the best way that they know how, because they don't have the right tools to deal with it. And so now kind of coming into your space, they're just kind of giving you what they got, which is like all this bad stuff, right? And so they're just surviving, and it's just kind of impacting everybody around them. Now, I say that not to excuse it, but just kind of explain a little bit. Now, how does the average person safeguard themselves from toxic people? Well, there's a couple of things that you could do. One of the first things you could do is actually check out the history. Check the facts, right? You want to kind of see who this person is. We can look at their history of broken relationships. When you're looking at a toxic person and their relationships, they actually have a long history of broken relationships. And going as far back as they can remember, they have stories of friendships that basically ended abruptly or on bad terms. They are always or often at odds with family members, and they're always highly judgmental of people that they don't even know. Which is really interesting, because if you don't know someone, you've never met someone, how are you so judgmental of them? You don't even know them, right? So that's a way of kind of safeguarding yourself, right? And also it's a way of kind of making yourself look better, because you have to kind of put someone down so low to make yourself look really, really good. I'm not saying that that's something everyone needs to do, but that's something a toxic person does. The next thing we look at is erratic employment history. Now, toxic people really do have a hard time with employment. Employment looks differently for different people, so just keep that in mind, right? So you could be a contractor, you can be an entrepreneur, you can actually just work for people, right? Just as a regular employee. But nonetheless, you have a hard time, that person has a hard time with employment. Generally, they have difficulty with authority or maybe chronic personnel issues, right? So even if you are that person is in charge of a company, they're always having personnel issues, and say they are working for someone, then they are the one that's always having personnel issues, right? Or always the one that's having an issue. Most likely, they do not have long periods of employment with one company, right? And so when you're dealing with like long periods, now that varies from person to person because you have to look at their actual history and their lifestyle to see what long term would actually look like for that person, okay? Now, often, the next one is oftentimes they themselves are so much the victim and misunderstood, meaning they're always the victim, something's always happening to them. They often basically dismiss every favorable outcome in their life as being the victim. Every situation, they are the victim. They spend a lot of time basically focused on the behaviors of others rather than their own. So they take no accountability and no responsibility for any of their behavior. And they see their negative behavior as justifiable under every and any circumstance. So no matter who they've engaged with or what they've engaged in, their behavior is justified, but everyone else's behavior caused their situation and caused them to be the victim. All right. And then another thing in the history that you can look at is that this person requires an abundance of support and affirmation. They require an abundance of support and affirmation. So here's the thing about toxic people, as we're talking about requiring a lot of support and affirmation. They come across as very, very confident, but this is really just a mask. They generally require a lot of emotional support, which is kind of draining to everybody else around them because they're very needy and they need to be needed, although they'll tell you that they don't, right? Their level of insecurity is actually manifested by being highly critical of others while expecting high levels of engagement and sympathy for their needs. So one of the things we talked about too is like how you're constantly putting others down as a way to kind of lift yourself up, right? And so by doing that, it's like you're constantly shooting everybody down, but then others around you, you want them to lift you up while you're putting somebody else down. So that's a way of kind of looking at that. Another thing that you can actually look at is, so we talked about looking at the history. Another thing you can look at is you can pay attention to the aspects of the toxic people, like what's happening to them. What happened to them in the past was one thing in their history, but what's happening to them now. What's happening around them now is one, they're not always toxic. So these are things that kind of make it very, very confusing, very, very convoluted. They're not always toxic. Well, this is why it makes it very difficult to determine if someone is toxic right off the bat. It's because their behavior is very, very erratic. Sometimes toxic people are extremely caring and engaging and pleasant, and it takes for time to pass for patterns to reveal themselves. And once the patterns reveal themselves, this is when you start realizing that the people are very, very difficult. So that can be challenging because you've kind of been in the relationship with someone for a little bit, regardless of what this relationship is, but you've been in a relationship for a while, long enough to recognize a pattern of the erratic behavior. And that's why it's impacting you so much, and that's why it gets a little confusing, right? The other thing is they carry their authority well. Toxic people are very, very confident in their stand on like completely everything, because whatever it is that they believe in, they're definitely very confident in what they believe in. I mean, they're convinced. They generally believe that they're doing their best, and they have a rational explanation for all the bizarre behaviors. So, they explain everything away. So, they decide to do something or do not decide to do something, then again, they're going to explain it away. If there's a challenge with something, they're going to explain it away. And so, if they're changing their mind about something suddenly, they're going to explain it away. And they're going to explain why they changed their mind on something. And then the last thing is the gaslighting tactic. So the gaslighting tactic is very, very harmful. All of this is very harmful, But this understanding gaslighting, right, can help you to understand why things can be so confusing. Gaslighting is basically a psychological form of manipulation. The victim basically is made to feel like you're going crazy due to due to the actions of the toxic person. Gaslighting actually leaves the victim apologizing and modifying their own behavior at the beck and call of the toxic person. When you're gaslighted, you're made to feel that you're the one that's always in the wrong. You're always questioning everything that you do. That's gaslighting. It is like master manipulation, and it's mental, and it just does something to you. And as a matter of fact, it is a method that is used in warfare. When it comes to prisoners of war, that is how they start kind of beating down individuals who are prisoners of war. It's gaslighting. It's a way of doing that. That level of manipulation, that they've done something wrong and make them question their own thoughts. So, and understanding that when you're in a relationship, in any form of relationship with a toxic person, and you're trying to figure out, is it me or is it them? This is why it gets so confusing, because of this level of gaslighting, right? Listen, if you have identified that someone in your life is toxic, it is important that you begin to take steps to keep your sanity and your safety. While not all toxic people are dangerous, all toxic people have the potential to undermine and impact others in big ways. They can have a detrimental impact on your life and your health and your mental health. You need to do whatever you must do to redefine your relationships and to keep yourself at arm's length from toxic people. And as I mentioned before, start planning your exit strategy from those who are toxic and get the help that you need. I know we make a lot of fun on social media about what your toxic traits are, but for those who are in relationships with individuals who show you or comments about what their toxic traits are, some of those toxic traits you need to pay a little bit closer attention to, and then start redefining your relationships with them so that you can remain healthy and safe. Thank you for joining me today on Tuesday Talks as we continue to talk about toxic situations. And this week we talked about trying to understand, is it me or is it them? Because it can be very, very confusing, and understanding who is a toxic person and why, and the tactics a toxic person uses to very much so confuse you in those relationships. I hope this has been very helpful to you in helping you to understand why it's so important for you to identify these traits and identify these situations for your health and your sanity. Thank you again for joining me. My name is Shawanda, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.